Well, hello everyone. I'm lucky enough to be speaking to you today from the beautiful lands of the Darkinjung people on the central coast of New South Wales. I'd like to recognise their continued connection to the land and the waters of this very special place and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are listening today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Brisbane Writers Festival series on Author-Illustrators, those incredible people who can weave magic with words and images, and in the case of our fantastic guest today, also music. I'm lucky enough today to be speaking to Matt Ottley. Well, I've been very much looking forward to this because Matt and I always have good conversations, and it's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you today, Matt. I was going to try and sort of sum up all of your awards and accolades in an introduction, but I think we'd be here almost for the full hour. So over the course of your career in making books, you've created over 40 books, I think, and won pretty much most of the prestigious literary awards in the sort of picture book world. I mean, just last year for How to Make a Bird, I think you scooped the Western Australia's Premier's Literary Award. It was shortlisted for the Queensland Premier's Literary Award, won the CBCA Picture Book of the Year Award, and was joint winner for the Prime Minister's Literary Award. And deservedly so, because your work is just staggering. And I was really lucky to be able to work with you on How to Make a Bird, and I think that's always going to be one of the best experiences of my life. So yeah, it'd be nice to sort of have a chance to sort of do a little post-mortem with you today, and it's just stunning to me what you're able to achieve with images. And I remember when I was just starting off on my illustration career and looking for books to inspire me, yours were the ones that I pulled off the shelf and sort of poured over and tried to kind of unpick the alchemy of them and work out how it was you did what you did. And I think that was way back when you'd done the Faust series, just looking at the way that you handled paint and images and visual narrative and things. And Faust is it's a much more generic sort of picture book, isn't it? I mean, like we've got a little dog who can see things that nobody else can see, and strange goings on, and it's very sort of kid-centric, and but it had a real magic to it. But since then, you've just kind of taken the entire genre in directions that are just breathtaking. So yeah, really, really excited to be able to talk to you today about how it is you do what you do and how you work your magic. Would you like to sort of just start off by at the beginning is always a good place to start, isn't it? So how did you end up sort of segueing into writing and illustrating? Where do you think it all began?
Oh, thanks, Sarah. And it's lovely to be chatting with you, being as how we work so closely on How to Make a Bird. I don't think did you say you were the art director on that book?
I don't think I did. No, but I was.
No, well, yeah, you were, and that's only the second time that's happened for me in my career, and it was an extraordinary experience. I just wished it had happened earlier and more often, because yeah, there's nothing like another set of eyes, or in the case of music, a set of ears, although you weren't anything to do with the music that's been written for How to Make a Bird, but just another professional's eyes, a colleague, someone with simpatico. It's amazing what that can bring out of yourself, and you think, damn, why didn't I think of that? But Okay, just before I start, I'm sitting here in glorious Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales on a mountaintop surrounded by rainforest. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's what in New Guinea, that's where I come from. I was born in Papua New Guinea, and we used to say up there, you feel most at home, and you will do what you're meant to be doing with your life when you are on your arse place, meaning somewhere that you want to plant your backside on the ground and just sit there.
Never get up again.
Yeah, that's what this part of the world feels like for me, probably because it reminds me of my birthplace in New Guinea. But I came to illustrating and writing books in a very roundabout way. I was actually at the time working as a jackaroo on a cattle station and just yearning to be getting back into my art. I think I was about 28 at the time. I had a picture book published when I was 18, 19. And then a picture book called Albert's Rainy Day that was published by Hodder and Stoughton. I then had a very itinerant life, sort of wandering around the countryside. I went overseas, worked for a short period of time as an equestrian painter in Great Britain, and did all sorts of different things. But I came back to Australia in my late 20s. I was working on a cattle station up in central Queensland and just yearning to get back to my art. And I thought, I'm just going to send this idea out to a publisher and see what they think. I was wildly inexperienced and had no idea about the business. I just loved story, loved narrative. So I thought that the fit for me was going to be picture books, even though I didn't really know much about them. And this letter came back from Belinda Bolliger, who was the editor at the time there, saying, we'd love to talk to you about this book. Huge surprise. And so that really changed the whole course of my life then. I came out of the bush and launched myself into that. And luckily, What Faust Saw sold really well. It became a bestseller very quickly. So I kind of got a false impression of what the whole business is like because I actually did make some decent income from that book. But I was very blessed. It sort of really set me up. But it was at the time that I was doing that book, I was also studying the paintings of Jean Vermeer, Renaissance Flemish painter. And the whole concept of the multi-layered meanings within visual arts and symbolism. So I took those ideas to picture books, and I wasn't aware of anyone else doing anything like it at the time. And well, to be absolutely honest, I was completely ignorant of what everyone else was doing anyway at the time.
Possibly the best state to be in.
Yeah, well, it's weird. It wasn't really until a few years into doing picture books that I actually started to look outwards at other people's work. And of course saw so many holes in my own work and was just gobsmacked by the beautiful work that a lot of other people were doing. But I'm really glad that it started the way it did, coming from this sort of sensibility of classical paintings, and the multi-layering of paintings, because that's the thing that I really, that's kind of the theme that woven its way through all of my work.
Yeah, all of your work has a really rich sort of iconographic weight to it, I think, where all the elements are bigger than just the object that you're painting. They've got a resonance and a sort of a meaning behind them. But it was interesting you saying that you didn't really know much about picture books as a genre or as a kind of an area in which to work. I think a lot of people gravitate towards picture books who love that alchemy, like that, the interplay between words and images, because really it's the only genre that will do it. And there's not many avenues for illustrated novels for adults. Graphic novels are quite a small market and things. And I think if you love that richness of imagery and the sort of, the magic that can be achieved when the words and the images kind of, I heard, was it Julia Marshall from Gecko Press? I think she described it as words and images each humming together and setting up a bigger hum beyond either of them. That sort of that I really liked. But I think that's something that you're stunningly good at, and that's it's obvious why you sort of gravitated towards picture books, because your language is incredibly resonant as well. And you wrote and illustrated the Faust series, but do you think I mean, even in Faust, even though it's we won't spend too long on Faust because we've got bigger things bigger fish to fry, so to speak. But I thought it was interesting that even in the Faust books, which were 1993, the first one, was it, or sometime in the
1994, late 1994.
Yeah. But even back then, when it was sort of embryonic match, really, wasn't it? That sort of series, that was you finding your feet and finding your way into that, as a genre. But even in that, you've got this hidden world that only Faust can see, and that sort of that fantastical world and those parallel realities overlapping, where there's the dog going about his day, but then there's all this other sort of stuff going on in the background, and that's one thing that fascinates me about your work, is that kind of the way that you kind of set up these bigger resonances and these bigger realities, and obviously your latest book, The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness, that's probably the culmination of the journey that you've had up till this point, isn't it? Your sort of most recent magnum opus. I'm sure it won't be the last, but I know it's a very important book from your point of view, in terms of opening up about those sort of the ways in which you create meaning in a life, and how you kind of hold on to yourself, particularly in the face of the kind of journey that you've had, where you've been battling pretty significant mental health issues, and that sort of sense of the universality of that experience, but also that it's very specific to your particular individual journey. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but I thought it was there's a sort of a commonality through all of your work of these kind of the richness of the symbolism that is very personal to you and very particular to you, but also very universal, and people respond to it. And it's a great way to kind of it's well, I should let you talk, really, shouldn't I? I'm sort of fumbling this a little bit.
Well,
I think yeah. It's just there's so many big ideas. I don't know where to start, really. So I'll let you take over. But I just thought that was interesting that even back then, when you're just starting off, there's that germ of what it will become in Faust, I think. That sort of.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said that, Sarah, because I look back at Faust now and I can see that it's it's a psychological profile of myself, that book. And I think it's why Jan Vermeer's paintings really spoke to me. And there was one particular painting, it's called, it's got lots of titles, but it's generally called Girl Asleep. And as a young woman at a table, sort of head on a hand, elbow on the table, she's sort of nodded off. And every object within that painting is symbolic of something. So for example, you can see past her across a corridor and into another room in which there's a mirror on a wall. The mirror at that time was very much symbolic of deep reflection of oneself. The fact it's in another room says that it's part of her subconscious. So she's not actually aware. You can't see her in the mirror. So she has to be in that other room in her deep subconscious before she will actually see herself. But she's asleep. She's in the real world. She's asleep. So she's not cognizant of that deeper self. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it's such a powerful statement of just a state of being that we are all in our waking worlds, and that there's all these other rooms and all this other goings on that's going on within us. And so you mentioned my struggles with mental health. Well, I have type 1 bipolar disorder, and a feature of it has been psychotic episodes, which started when I was a child. So I didn't, in my 20s, when I wrote What Faust Saw, I really wasn't aware that I was actually writing about my own childhood, because there's this dog that sees things that no one else, no human can see. And it's extraordinary how, people talk about writers writing their first novel is generally very autobiographical. Well, What Faust Saw was very autobiographical, and that theme of exploring the self and of using symbolism to do that has just basically followed me throughout my life, throughout my work. Now, I believe that the greatest art comes from the tensions that you feel between the lines of a thing. So, for example, Beethoven's music is so great because it is always threatening to fall apart. It never quite works between note to note, but it's brilliant within the whole. So you're expecting the whole thing to just unravel and fall apart. So it's got that, it's humming with tension.
That unresolved tension.
Yeah, and that is what's so great about it. And I just feel that it's the work that isn't quite resolved. It's those artworks, it's that writing where you feel the writer has struggled, the painter has struggled.
Where you're reaching for something.
Yeah. So, I to be honest, I really don't know what I'm doing across all the fields that I work in. If I don't know, I couldn't explain to you what happens in say the music. I'm writing a symphony at the moment, and I can't tell you what I'm doing. I just kind of ramble on with the music and not knowing what's going to happen. I get an idea of it in my head. It's like you get an idea of a painting, and something happens between your head and the brush in your hand. Or in the case of music, the note going on to the stave, something happens where you lose control and you really don't know what you're doing. And that thing that's inside your head, you can never quite capture. But it's that dissonance that happens between the two that makes the work, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's really interesting, because actually one of the questions I'd written down that I really wanted to ask you, because I'm really curious, is I wanted to know what you thought of the original sort of Greek concept of the muses as basically as the artist as a sort of a conduit for something larger than themselves that sort of comes in and takes over. And because I get a sense of that from your work, that there's this kind of like you're channeling something huge, and very adroitly. I know you say you don't know what you're doing, but you're doing an awfully good job of faking it, I've got to say. Very convincing. But yeah, so I wondered if that was what the process felt like for you, almost as if you were channeling something.
Yeah, yeah. To be honest, I've always been highly suspicious of that as a concept. Um, you know, when people say that they feel that they're channeling something, I don't know. If to me, it comes across one of two ways. One is that in the case of someone like me, for example, and I readily admit that I don't know what I'm doing, that it's, you know, that I'll do a million drawings to arrive at one that I'm satisfied with, and I still don't know how I did it. It worked, why it works. It's just, you know, I'm just kind of fumbling through a fog and finding something. There's that one, or there's the other approach, which is that, you know, someone like Mozart has chosen me to channel through, and that's awfully arrogant, you know, awfully egotistical. So, and I really don't feel anything like that. It's, look, I cannot answer that question. I don't know where it comes from. Well, you're a creative artist as well. You would, I don't know, you when you zero in on exactly where inspiration comes from, it's where it's hidden.
Well, I think that's why
You
I'm
know,
so interested to ask it, because you know that's something I struggle with. Like I'm not very good at getting in the zone and getting in the flow, and I just but it's almost like I mean, especially since in your recent work you're exploring um concepts that are I mean you're basically exploring yourself, aren't you, and your own consciousness, and trying to make sense of your identity. So it
yeah.
must be a kind of a real reaching within, and kind of um I mean yeah.
Well, actually, what you just said then explains it all to me. You're trying to make sense of. That about sums it up for me. The creative urge.
Mm,
It's trying to make sense of something that you can't really understand yourself. I do it in a very multimodal, although the word that I use, which I borrowed this term from I think it comes from the world of transport, which sounds very pedestrian, but to me it really works well, and that's intermodal. So, for example, there's a section in the Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness where the image is of the boy, adolescent boy. He has this tree growing inside of him whose flower is ecstasy, but whose fruit is unbearable sadness. The tree gets too powerful for the medicine that the boy has, and it starts growing out of him. So it comes out of his mouth and his eyes and his ears, and it gradually encases him. He becomes the tree. But while that process is happening, in the music that goes with the work, there's a 68 part fugue. A fugue is a piece of music where you have a tune. It's like row, row, row your boat, you know, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Someone else will come in a little after you've started, and it's a melody that's designed so you can come in on multiple points, and you'll end up with all these harmonies happening. It's called a canon, but it's the simplest sort of form of a fugue. A fugue is actually where the melody itself develops and all the iterations of it similarly develop. Most fugues I think the largest fugue in the Western canon of music was J.S. Bach's fugue from the B minor Mass, and that's a 7-part fugue. So in my book, I wanted to get across to the audience what it is like inside one's head when you're hearing multiple voices and there are multiple thought processes going on. So, and it just becomes this sort of maelstrom, this cacophony. So the best way I could do that was not visually, I thought, but musically. So the part of the music that accompanies that image is this 68 part fugue where the entire orchestra just kind of turns into this vortex of sound. And the two, so the image, the words that lead into that section and the music all combine in this intermodal way to create the whole. And the full meaning can only be sort of garnered when all three parts are experienced together. Yeah.
I remember that being extraordinarily powerful when I came to the screening of the film at your launch, and that particular moment where your images are on screen in their full glory, viewed larger than life, which I think is how they should be viewed. I think they're bigger than a book. But that combined with the surround sound of, you know, the orchestra and the voices and the layering of that sort of, like you were saying, that tension building, you know, it's quite extraordinary. And it strikes me that, like, you know, you're talking about Vermeer's painting and the extraordinary economy of that image of the mirror, like in, you know, having an object representing such a complex concept of identity and self-awareness. It seems to me that what you're doing with your intermodal work is really working out how to layer those kind of metaphors, almost like whether they're musical motifs that create a sort of visceral emotional response, or words or images, you know, like coming together. You know, that layering and building and the way they resonate off each other is extraordinarily powerful and quite groundbreaking too. I mean, there can't be many people who actually work that way. I don't.
I'm sure there must be. I'm not aware of anyone. I have gone looking, but haven't been able to. I haven't come across anybody yet who works in a similar way. There are plenty of illustrators who are also musicians, and plenty of writers who are musicians, and sort of, you know, vice versa. Some people sort of work professionally across the different fields like that, but I'm not aware of anyone else who really interweaves and interlinks them quite the way I do. But also, you know, my music is for want of a better word, I don't not like it, but it's the word people use. It's art music. It's not pop music. And so yeah, no, I'm not aware of any other composers who work with orchestras, for example, who are also writers and illustrators.
But it allows you to create something with extraordinary emotional reach, I think. You know, like you're dealing with these ideas that are really visceral and really loaded and very powerful, and you've got so many tools that you can use to kind of represent the sort of emotion that you're trying to convey. I think you're hitting people on many different levels, but you know, because I think music activates a certain area of response, and then words and images sort of hit differently, but the three together kind of you know, sort of creates this incredible resonance. And I think it's a real shame that you know, it would be great to have more avenues to kind of present the thing in all its glory, you know. As I mean, the film does really. Maybe we should go back and just explain to people, you know, how the film fits into the book. So you've created, actually, I've got a copy of it here. This is the Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness, which is the most incredible work of art. And then you've created a film that sort of animates the book and is narrated as well as having a full orchestra and choir accompanying it.
There's just while you've, sorry to interrupt there, but while you've got the book, if you take the cover off, you see the cover represents the flower of the tree, and the actual hard case, which you probably won't see on screen.
Terrible job of taking the cover off here.
Represents the darkness, because
stunning.
And there is the title on there, but it's it's glossed, so you can't actually read it unless you pivot it into the light.
Yeah,
so that sort of multi-layering sort of is happening at the cover, you know. So I just love the idea that a book can be used as this sort of multi-layered symbolic thing right from the cover through.
Every element of it works.
Yeah, and I'll come back to that to talk about how to make a bird, if I may, in a minute. But yeah, the music thing. Well, the Tree of Ecstasy actually began with a piece of music. It was in 2008. I'd just been recovering from a major episode, and there have been times when I've been really unwell where I haven't been able to understand language. So when people are speaking, I can't understand what they're saying. I can internalize language and just got it in my head. I just can't understand it when it's coming out of other people's mouths. Instead, I would just see all this color and shape coming out of their mouths, and the sound was gobbledygook. But in that state, my concept of sound and of music was has always just been sort of switched up a few notches. So I just stayed in the room in the place I was living in and started writing music, because that was my safe place to go to. I could just immerse myself in this internal sound that was in my head of music. So the first 5 minutes of what became the symphony, the Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness, that was written then in 2008. And then it was a later episode where I was recovering again and keeping a diary in which I wrote a poem. And the first words that came to me were the Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness. And that text, that poem, is what is the text in the book. So it was 2015, I think, that Margreta Lamond suggested that I should, that this would make a picture book. So it was kind of accidental that I'd been working in music and also writing. They were two separate things. They weren't, I wasn't consciously thinking they'd be related, but then at the right time, it just seemed obvious they should go together. And they became the seed of this particular project. But I work every year with the West Australian Symphony Orchestra on a project called The Sound of Picture Books, where a small ensemble from the orchestra performs on stage with the images from my picture books up on screen, while the author, or if the author's not there, either me or someone else is there narrating. So the whole thing is a live performance. And then we do all this other sort of workshop type interactive stuff with the audience, which is all about an intermodality. So for example, I'll get someone up from the audience and I'll draw their portrait and then turn that into a piece of music, which I'll then direct the players on stage to sight read and play. I'm writing all this music on a whiteboard. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, sounds fantastic.
We're just trying to get it happening on the east side now. We did have a performance scheduled for Sydney in a couple of weeks from now, but just because of my health, I've had to actually cancel that this year, which is a shame. But hopefully we'll be getting the Sound of Picture Books performances happening on the east side here, because it's been going for about 10 years in West Australia and it's been really successful.
We'll look out for it down here. Sounds amazing. And do you want to tell us a little bit about the journey of recording the sound for Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable sound is because you actually travelled to Europe, didn't you, and recorded in.
Yeah, well, it's the book, if you like. It was published by Dirks Lane Press, because I love working with Margrethe Lamond, and we'd become friends and we work really well together. But in a sense, it's a self-published book because we were lucky to have a philanthropist, an organisation called GALT, Gabby Arts Legacy Trust, headed by a man called Sam Silipo, who's just the most extraordinary human being. He wanted to fund a significant arts project on the theme of mental health. So it was just extraordinarily lucky that his world and my world sort of came together at the time. He funded the entire project, all the production of the book, the music, and my gorgeous wife Tina, who's a great, it's her voice on the recording, by the way. She's a writer, illustrator herself.
And a brilliant narrator.
And yeah, we've discovered there's hidden talent she has of voiceover. But anyway, she's also amazing at research. And we had enough money. We had a substantial amount of money donated to us. Wasn't quite enough for an Australian state orchestra. There's a few orchestras that were really interested in taking part, but we just simply couldn't afford them. And so Tina found an organisation in the Czech Republic. Turns out that one of the orchestras that we worked with, the Brno Philharmonic Orchestra, is hugely world renowned, and they actually play on a lot of soundtracks of major Hollywood blockbuster movies. Really tight, fabulous orchestra. We could afford them, and I'm so glad it worked out that way, because the musicianship, the level of musicianship was just another level, And we worked also with the Czech Philharmonic Choir of Brno, which at that time was ranked as Europe's leading choir. So extremely lucky. So we flew over to the Czech, and we were there for 2 really intense days while the whole piece was recorded.
Just 2 days.
Yeah,
that must have been intense. It's astonishing.
it was. Yeah. Well, that's the astonishing nature of that orchestra and choir, is that basically the first time they'd all played this thing together was the morning we met on day 1, and by the end of day 2, though, it was, they were playing it just brilliantly. And we took a young tenor. This is his first professional role, Ben Reynolds. He's a local boy in my community here. Absolutely gorgeous. So we flew him to the Czech Republic as well.
And you've got the lyrics for his librettos in the back of the book as well. Yeah. So it's sort of another little meta text on top of the text of the story itself. And speaking of the story itself, I mean, what you've done is quite an extraordinarily visceral exploration of the experience, like the lived experience of struggling with psychosis and having a significant mental health issue, and it's quite extraordinary, like seeing it from the outside, and the sort of the range of emotions that you create within the book, and the sort of the immediacy of the experience of living through it, that you convey through the images and the words, is really powerful. You go from these incredibly tortuous kind of writhing illustrations of the boy trapped in this tree that's growing around him, and this kind of constriction and tension, and I mean it's really like a torture instrument that he's kind of not just imprisoned within, but also sort of becoming, trapped within his own self, and then you go from that to this incredibly tender illustration of just a tiny baby bird alone on a page, and then these soaring sort of panoramas of I remember, like, when I was at the screening, this extraordinary image of it was an aerial view of a river with elephants wading through it, and the bluebird flying across it. Almost moved me to tears. I mean, it was just so beautifully done. And I think you know, the way that you're crafting the images in this book is just breathtaking in terms of what you're managing to do with the emotional resonance of how, of course, I'm gravitating towards the images, but, you know, just the sort of, I just opened to a page at random. I mean, I mean, this is just stunning. You know, just the going from an image like that with this sense of kind of, you know, creative possibility and freedom to these kind of, you know, tormented images of this boy being, you know, devastated basically and eclipsed. I was wondering, like, do you have a visceral response to seeing those images now? Like, is it hard for you to sort of look at them or look back on them?
Yeah, it is. It is. I think since the screening you saw in Sydney, which was what, March the 1st, I think? No, February the 28th. I might have looked at the book once since then, but I certainly haven't looked at any of it for weeks and weeks now. It was a fairly torturous process actually doing the book, because it did sort of threaten to take me back to a few dark places from my history. But I just felt that, you know, I know what it's like to feel the stigma. You know, I know what it's like to be that rambling person on the street that everyone sort of skirts around and looks sideways at. And yeah, so I just felt this is something that I needed to do. I needed to add my bit to the ongoing conversation, because we really, you know, it's not really far beneath the surface. We still marginalize people who suffer from complex mental illness. You know, I've been lucky. I've had a lot of really loving people around me to support me at times where I could have been on the street. So, you know, I'm lucky I didn't ever sort of transition through that very, very thin tissue that separates out a person with a relatively successful life and someone who is struggling on the street. You know, that there were times where that was a very, very thin tissue. You know,
I remember at the launch you told a story that really highlighted that, of, you know, two completely different experiences at the hands of mental health professionals, you know, some of whom treated you as a human with compassion and some of whom totally dehumanized you in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was experiences like that just pushed me on. You know, it's a time in my life where I felt strong enough to create this project. But I have, since it's been released, I have tried emotionally to distance myself from it as best I can, because you know, complex mental illness is not something that ever goes away. It's with you for life. And, you know, for most people, even on medication that works for you, it's still a management plan. You know, you still have to be very careful with how you manage your life. But, you know, on the positive side, it's I'm one of those people for whom the illness has also blessed me with creativity. You know, I can see and hear music with absolute crystal clarity inside my head. You know, it's and I know that it's connected with the condition, because when I've been medicated on certain psychiatric drugs, my mojo has just disappeared. I've lost that ability to see and to hear things really clearly. And you know, I don't actually believe that something like type 1 bipolar disorder actually can give a person sort of heightened talent. All it does is give you a heightened desire, passion to do the thing. Because as I said, I struggle. I actually don't know how to do what I do. You know, it's always a torture.
You have a drive to do it.
It's just that drive. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things I was wondering, because I think, you know, like you must need to have that drive to kind of create what you've created, because it's an incredibly brave thing to do, to actually, you know, want to kind of engage with it and wrestle with it and make sense of it and bring it out into the light and translate it into a language so that other people can kind of experience that experience. I mean, that takes an awful lot of fortitude. It would be a lot easier to bury it, or, you know, subdue it somehow, and you know, or do you feel like it has to be faced, like it's just kind of
well, it's yeah, no, that's a fabulous question. It's no one's quite put me in the corner like you have just now with that question.
Sorry to put you in that.
No, it's great. It's because you know, I can kind of give the sort of, you know, pat answer that I want to contribute to the ongoing conversation about complex mental illness, and I have lived experience. Therefore, if I can express that to people, they might get in a holistic artistic sense, they might emotionally get it. But there is the other side of the equation, in that once I started this project, like any other project I've done, I've become really obsessed with it. The thing itself, regardless of what it's about. So, you know, and I'm sure you understand that as a visual artist yourself, it becomes irrelevant what the thing is when you're actually working on it. It's just a series of shapes and light and shade and line, and you just obsess about getting that right until you've obsessed so much that you think, well, I can't do any more to it. Often then you're still thinking, oh, I'm not really pleased with it, but it's the best I can do. And you've kind of, you've exhausted yourself.
Yeah, well,
it's a big part of the equation.
It is, isn't it? The best that you can do is pretty darn good, even if you're not happy with it. It's astonishing. And I mean, you've chosen to kind of sort of shape this entire book as a sort of an allegory, rather than a sort of a Requiem for a Beast, which was, you know, was that your first intermodal work? That was the first one. Yeah. And that was
the first.
Yeah, and it's sorry, you carry on.
I was just going to say, yes, it was the first one that the publishers sort of agreed to include the music with. Yeah, but I mean, I had been working that way prior to that anyway. You know, for years I'd been writing music to get ideas for the look of characters in books, and vice versa. You know, it's just sometimes I'm really not sure whether I'm drawing or writing music. Sometimes they blur so much. But excuse me, yeah, that was the first time that I kind of did it in a sort of fully public way. Sorry, what was the question?
I don't think I quite formulated one yet. I think where I was heading with that was that's a lot sort of more gritty and and more gritty realism, more grounded in autobiographical, facts, I guess, and dealing with, sort of real events in a kind of a, you know, a sort of a more representational way, I suppose. And then Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness, it's a sort of allegorical journey, isn't it, through the process of losing yourself in a sort of psychosis, I guess, and then coming out the other end and making peace and sort of resolving all the different aspects of the self and kind of working out how to live within that within that reality.
And there's a reason for that. That Requiem for a Beast is very autobiographical. It's not just my story though. It's the story of a Bunjalung elder who gave me her story to put into the book. And because of what it's about, it kind of makes sense that it's I mean, nobody would necessarily know that the protagonist in Requiem for a Beast, that it is my story, it's autobiographical. That's not important, but as you say, is a story based in sort of gritty reality. For the Tree of Ecstasy, if it had been a story that, say, I'd written in first person, then someone reading or listening to it would be distanced, because it's a story about that person over there. It's nothing to do with them. My objective in the Tree of Ecstasy was to give audiences a felt, visceral experience through art forms of what it is like to have psychosis. Therefore, they needed to be part of the journey. So I chose, well, look, this was all happily accidental, because the text in the book it's a long form poem basically, and it was written originally it was just written as part of a recovery diary. So I had no intention for it to become anything other than something in my private diary. It went through a few sort of mutations during the early period of working with my Greta on it, and it sort of cycled back to being pretty much what it was in the original form. But it just so happened that it is sort of in a fable-like form. It is like a fable. And I think that's why it does work, because fables are sort of all-encompassing. They are culturally about everyone. They're not about a specific person, even though there might be a particular character around which they're centered. They are more universal. So that was sort of happily accidental, but it is the major difference between those two works, is that the second one, the Tree of Ecstasy, which is my second work for adults primarily, and then young adults, there's whatever it is, 20 years or no, is it? 12, 13, 14, 15 years or something between those two works. But it had to be in a different form. Otherwise, it would have created that sort of invisible barrier between the work and the reader. And that's not what I wanted.
Yeah, it really sets up that sort of immediacy of response, doesn't it? And I think even though it is about it is about a particular journey and a particular experience, like you say, it's also got that universality to it. Like it's almost an allegory for apart from that specific lived experience of going through that finding equilibrium within a sort of a psychotic episode in that period of it's also kind of a universal sort of metaphor for trying to make sense of existence and consciousness, and finding a sense of self, and losing yourself, and working out what's important to you, and finding your way back to some sort of truth, which I think is, that's kind of universal to everybody, whatever background they're coming from, or whatever particular set of circumstances they're struggling with. It's not easy being a sentient being, is it? And
No,
yeah,
no, and that's
self-awareness,
that's lovely that you put it that way. And in order for it to work that way, to be universal and to be about that universal human journey, it has to be allegorical. It has to be in a sort of fable form, because there is also the layer in it that poses a large question mark around the nature of belief as well.
I think you said something about having a bit of a tilt at religions that aren't centered around belief, but are centered around dogma, and sort of that are rigid and unforgiving, rather than faith-based.
Yeah, absolutely. It's if you take, it always struck me as a really interesting thing, and one that I'm not so sure why people can't really see this clearly, because it seems very clear to me that if you take the stories, the fables, the myths, the truths, whatever you want to call them, the stories from within many religious belief systems, and then you kind of seal them with dogma, so that they become sort of the templates for behavior, that we read modes of behavior into those stories, that we must behave in certain ways, we must think in certain ways. Then in that light, a lot of those stories are basically not much different from psychotic episodes. The book of Revelations, for example, is, to me, I've met so many people in psych wards who have that kind of experience, but they're mad. So that's just called a psychotic episode. Whereas the book of Revelations is it's this sort of divine insight into the way one should be seeing the world and approaching one's fellow human. But if you do it, if you apply it in a dogmatic way, that seems to be what emerges from over a period of time within a lot of religious belief systems, that story, to me, is not much different from a psychotic episode. Now, a psychotic episode can be laced with lots of insight and truth, but it's also madness. It's also a person's brain chemistry gone AWOL, and shouldn't be read as being anything more than that. It's enormous. It's something that needs to be approached with love and generosity and with open arms and a big heart.
Do you think it comes back to that difference between interpreting things rigidly and literally, and allowing things to have symbolic weight and be interpreted metaphorically, like the mirror in the Vermeer picture that you mentioned at the beginning? I guess the book of Revelations, if you're interpreting it absolutely rigidly and literally, it becomes this restrictive ideology. Whereas if you let things have symbolic resonance and expand beyond their borders and be more universally applicable, then it's got that sort of openness and
then it becomes divine. Yeah, absolutely. Then that elusive thing of divinity, which we're all chasing after, it has to remain elusive, I think, and if it does so, if it remains elusive, it remains beautiful. It remains the thing that you yearn for, that idea of I've got I've got COVID brain, so I go foggy.
I've got no excuse.
Unconditional love.
Yeah.
You know, that the idea that yeah, the thing that we all yearn for, that we all lose when it gets swallowed up in dogma, basically. And you know, I had 2 different occasions when I was really unwell. I had people from different churches strongly urging me to have exorcisms done on myself. I'm not talking about the Catholic Church. One was, but another was a different belief system, because they were absolutely sure I'd been invaded by evil spirits because of the childhood I'd spent in New Guinea.
Wow.
You know, now
That's quite
that is just dogmatic rubbish. But you'd be surprised at how much of that kind of dogmatic belief.
And is that the kind of
out there.
experience that you've embodied in the figure of the Queen in the Tree of Ecstasy?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's absolutely grotesque. She's fantastic, but she's like sort of a symbol of that kind of figurehead of an institution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love I thought it was really clever. So when the Queen's introduced, we sort of see her raised above us, and she's surrounded by a curtain, and you just see her sort of head and shoulders, and she's looming out into this audience hall, basically. And then in the subsequent images, you see behind the curtain, she's got this monstrous sort of insectoid abdomen stretching behind her and producing Lord knows what. And that was just the best image of, you know, I mean, yeah, talk about a visceral response. I mean, you couldn't have come up with a better sort of way of portraying that kind of that sort of institutional depravity, I guess, and that it's all sort of hidebound and sort of unwieldy, but immovable and grotesque, and yeah.
Well, that's why she has transparent skin, which her on this bloated body, you know, you can see all her internal organs. It's just this massive heaving guts, and you'll see the attendants there in all their finery are just stitching together beautifully sort of embroidered fabric to cover her body.
Yeah, with all the pomp and ceremony and trappings of power, and underneath there's this kind of bloated, corpulent mass sort of digesting everything. No, I thought that was really effective. And then that set against the little protagonist bird, who was just, you know, sort of just this beautiful sort of emblem of freedom and exploration. Yeah.
If you look, I had a lot of fun actually with one of the images. It's where the bird has left the palace and is flying out as this very vibrant evening sky.
Yes,
and what you're seeing, it takes a bit of looking at, but you see that the end of the bloated body of the Queen hanging out of the building.
Yes.
and there's a great hole in the city below her. This is the city is obviously her toilet pit. So she lives in this sort of elevated, grotesque world and literally just shits on all the people that are her subjects.
See, but that's what I love about your work. You couldn't get a more kind of like repulsive image than that, you know, speaking truth to power, but then you combine it with this celestial light, you know, this sense of transcendent beauty, and the bird flying off, and, you know, it's this lovely sort of dichotomy that you've got going there. And I think again that comes back to your layering that you do with there's that layering of symbols that you were talking about again. Like it's not, you know, you're not just focusing on one thing. It's kind of you know, all the different elements that combine to sort of make up existence. And
Yeah, well, and I really believe as well that you can say the most powerful things if you do it not through the mode of shock and awe, but of beauty.
Mm.
You know, you can express the most exquisite, and I mean exquisite in its original sense, exquisite grief, you know, deep grief through the most beautiful imagery or the most beautiful words, or the words that if you are in a state of grief will kind of give you great solace because of their beauty. If you're not in a state of grief, will give you great empathy within that moment for that state of grief. You know, that beauty, I think, is the great unifier, is the great salve. It is the thing that elevates us to what we would like to be as human beings, that we just struggle, constantly struggle with, because we don't get there. We aren't that. We aren't really truly sentient, loving beings.
And we're embodied too in this kind of, you know, we have this sense of the sublime and this sense of beauty and the sense of reaching for something beyond ourselves, and we're stuck in our physical manifestations, you know, dealing with the day-to-day, trying to keep body and soul together. And you know, I think that's why we need work like yours to remind us that there's this, you know, this other level to sort of focus on and aspire to. Because, you know, it's just absolutely stunning. I think we may actually have almost run out of time, because I'm conscious that you need to get away fairly soon.
We do. I have a doctor's appointment that I need to get to.
Oh, darn, I quite happily sit here and talk to you all day. But before you go, thanks so much for this. It's been just magnificent. But can I ask you one last question? Really fascinated to hear your answer to this. That when you are in the flow and you're creating, and there's no one else around, and you're managing to sort of just, you know, get into that state of channeling whatever it is you're channeling. If the inside of your mind was a physical space that you could stand in and look around and explore, what sort of space would you be standing in? What would it look like?
I'd be right smack in the middle of a giant star nebula. I'd just see this universe of shape and pattern and swirling color and velvet blackness against which this gorgeous color is, I think.
Beautiful. Sounds like a nice place to be.
Yeah, maybe some people would find that scary, but I just think of that as being at home, to be sort of feeling that there is an entire universe around you, and it's cradling you, and it's very beautiful.
That's wonderful. I think that's an absolutely gorgeous note to end on. We didn't get a chance to talk about how to make a bed, but I think that's because Tree of Ecstasy is so enormous, and there's so much to say about it. But it's been an absolute delight, Matt, and thanks so much for sharing your process and your thoughts. And I'll look forward to having an opportunity to do this again at some point.
Thank you, Sarah. It's just been a pleasure. You're always just wonderful, so gorgeous to speak with. Thank you.
You too. Bye now.
Bye-bye.